Every seeable thing that exists is made up of hard and soft edges, so understanding how they work is incredibly important. An indicator of an artist having a lot of painting skill and experience is that instead of thinking of themselves as drawing and painting individual objects, they draw and paint edges. And the good news is, it's very possible to learn how. Edges exist in a range from soft to hard, and for shadow edges, you need to know when and why to use what kind. Hard shadow edges occur when there is an abrupt plane change, like the edges on a cube, and soft shadow edges occur when there is a gradual plane change, like you would see on a rounded surface. Then there's of course the full range in between. Cast shadows, which are created by an object blocking light from hitting another surface, work a little differently. When the object casting the shadow and the surface it exists on are very close together, the edges of the shadow are fairly sharp. Then, if you start to bring the object farther away, the shadow gets softer and lighter. This is because there is now more room for light to be let in. Cast shadows getting softer farther from the object of origin can also be seen when the shadow is cast to the side of the object. Here the shadow starts out with a pretty hard edge, and as you get further away from the object, it gets much softer. To achieve this effect yourself, it isn't necessary, but really helps to have some sort of blending tool. In Photoshop, I use the mixer brush with these settings. You can start by painting in this shadow shape with all hard edges, and then use a soft brush to lighten the shadow where it's further from the object, where more light is getting in. And after that, blend out the further edges. Start with very subtle softening, and make it more dramatic as you work your way down the shadow. The change from hard to soft should be gradual. If there is a recognizable point where you started blending the lines, it'll usually look a bit sloppy. If you don't have a blending tool, you could instead soften the farther edges of the cast shadow by using a brush with pressure opacity. Paint around the edges to soften them. Changing your brush size as you paint will give you more control over how hard or soft you make the edges. Be sure that when you're done, the sharp edge underneath the soft shadow isn't visible anymore, and instead looks like a nice smooth transition out of the shadow. Say you have this drawing that you want to render. Before doing anything else, it can be helpful to figure out where you want to put your shadows at this stage, and what they should look like. You only need two values: white to represent areas hit by light, and gray to represent shadows. Right now, you don't need to think about color, or ambient occlusion, or anything else that will complicate the values of your scene, but instead, just think about what areas should be in shadow, and how the edges of the shadows should look. Imagine that everything is made of white clay. Decide where you'd like your light source to be, and work from that, giving this clay scene some dimension. Another thing that will be useful here is the lasso tool, which, combined with a soft airbrush, will allow you to get sharp edges and soft gradients very quickly. I talk more about the lasso tool in a different video that you could watch after this one. The final result will look something like this, which is a great starting point, and even looks cool just as it is. From here, your next steps can be adding some ambient occlusion, aka darker nooks and crannies, to your shadows, changing the shadow color from gray to something more interesting, and setting your layer with the shadows on it to the multiply blending mode. That then allows you to add color underneath. After this, I would keep painting more detail and color on top. I find this process pretty fun and satisfying. Another thing we can talk about is lost edges. When you have a similar light against light, or similar dark against dark, the edge between those objects can disappear completely. This is, I think, a pretty underrated trick that I myself need to use more. Here's an example. On this skeleton drawing of mine, I let both the light and shadow sides of the skull merge with the background, but it still very much looks like a skull is there, even though you can't see a lot of it. You've probably been taught this before, but I'm sure most of you can't say you've actually used it very much. It's something you learn in art class and then forget about. Try finding ways to apply this in your own work, and you might be surprised what you can do with it. On this character illustration, I wouldn't say most of these edges I've softened are fully lost, since there is also the separation of color between objects and not just value, but the same idea is still there. I've softened the separation of objects that have similar value, and I decided to do this only in shadow so that the areas in light would really pop. This is following the art rule of putting more detail in either light or shadow. When you first learn this concept, it can be confusing to figure out how you are meant to apply it, but much easier when you start thinking of detail as meaning sharp edges. If you want detail in light, your sharp edges can go in the light, and the edges in shadow can be softer. The last thing I'd like to mention is adding line to your hard shadow edges. Back to my skeleton drawing, I did this in a few places. It's an optional fun way to make your hard shadow edges feel extra sharp and pop out in contrast to the softness in other areas. In color, I like to make these lines pretty saturated. Like red on the skin, for example, makes the effect more lively and vibrant. Here's my lasso tool video, and a video where I explain ambient occlusion and other types of light and shadow. Either of those will go well with and add on to what I've talked about here. Thanks for watching!